Swearing to marry the very next man to walk through the doors, she made a reckless joke in a dim Mayfair drawing-room that would forever alter two powerful dynasties. She had braced herself for a lowly footman, but it was England's most dangerous, scandal-ridden duke who crossed the threshold instead. In the stifling, glittering world of London's high society, in the spring of 1814, a woman's worth was measured entirely by the title she could secure. Lady Beatrice Fane, the fiercely independent daughter of John Fane. The 10th Earl of Westmoreland knew this brutal reality all too well, while her peers obsessed over the exclusive vouchers to Almack's and the ruthless social gatekeeping of Sarah Villiers, the Countess of Jersey. Beatrice sought refuge in the expansive libraries of her father's Mayfair estate. She was 21, an age perilously close to spinsterhood in the eyes of the ton, and her father's patience had thoroughly evaporated. The afternoon of April 14th was violently dismal. A relentless freezing rain battered the tall leaded glass windows of the Westmoreland drawing-room, mirroring Beatrice's foul mood. She was pacing the length of the Persian rug, the heavy silk of her emerald day dress rustling furiously with every sharp turn. Seated by the roaring hearth was her cousin, Lady Penelope, meticulously embroidering a handkerchief and offering unhelpful platitudes. "You cannot avoid him forever." "Beatrice," Penelope murmured, not looking up from her needlework. "Lord Rutledge is perfectly respectable. He has an estate in Cornwall, 30,000 a year, and he is a viscount. Your father has all but signed the settlement papers." Beatrice scoffed a sound highly unbefitting an earl's daughter. "Lord Rutledge is 52 years old, Penelope. He smells distinctly of boiled cabbage and damp wool, and his only passion in life is categorizing his collection of dead beetles. If I am forced to spend the next 40 years listening to him wheeze through dinner, I shall throw myself into the Thames." "Be dramatic if you must, but Uncle John will not tolerate another refusal," Penelope warned, setting her hoop down. "You have already dismissed 3 eligible suitors this season. The Prince Regent himself commented on your stubbornness at the Carlton House fete last week. You are running out of time and out of options." The heavy oak doors of the drawing-room remained firmly shut, separating the young women from the bustling household staff in the corridor. Beatrice threw her hands up in exasperated defeat, her dark eyes flashing with rebellious fire. The pressure was a physical weight on her chest. Her father's ultimatums had become daily occurrences, backed by the very real threat of exiling her to a remote, crumbling manor in Yorkshire if she did not perform her familial duty. "Options!" Beatrice cried out, her voice echoing off the high-plastered ceilings. "I have no options. I am treated as a mare at Tattersall's, paraded about for men who only care about the political influence my father wields in the House of Lords. I am so utterly sick of the pretense, Penelope. I would honestly prefer a stranger." "In fact," she declared, throwing her arms wide in a theatrical gesture of absolute surrender, "I am so desperate to escape the miserable clutches of Lord Rutledge, I swear upon my life I'll marry the very first man who enters this room." Penelope laughed, a light, tinkling sound. "Be careful, Beatrice. Thomas was just polishing the silver in the hall. You might find yourself bound to a footman. At least Thomas has a full head of hair and decent teeth." Beatrice countered, a defiant, reckless smile playing on her lips. "I stand by my vow. The first man to cross that threshold shall have my hand. It cannot possibly be worse than the fate my father has engineered." As if summoned by the very audacity of her words, the heavy brass handle of the drawing-room door began to turn. Beatrice froze, the smile dying on her lips. Penelope gasped, her embroidery slipping from her lap to the floor. The heavy oak door swung inward with a slow, agonizing creak. Beatrice braced herself, expecting the familiar livery of one of her father's servants, bearing tea, or perhaps the Earl himself, coming to deliver another harsh lecture. Instead, a towering silhouette filled the doorway. The man who stepped over the threshold was not a servant. He was soaking wet, a heavy riding cloak draped over his broad shoulders, dripping rainwater onto the pristine hardwood floors. He pulled off his drenched leather gloves with a slow, deliberate motion, his presence instantly suffocating the vast room. It was Tristan Cavendish, the Duke of Harrington. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. Penelope let out a soft, strangled squeak of sheer terror. Tristan Cavendish was not merely a peer of the realm. He was a walking, breathing scandal. A veteran of the brutal Peninsular War, he bore a faint, wicked scar along his sharp jawline, a souvenir from the siege of Badajoz. But it was not his military past that made society hostesses tremble. It was his reputation. He was known as the Devil of Devonshire, a man rumoured to have ruined 3 noblewomen in Paris, duelled twice on the continent, killing 1 man, and openly mocked the rigid moral codes of London high society. He was lethally handsome, immensely powerful, and utterly ruthless. He stood there for a long moment, the scent of rain, damp wool and rich tobacco preceding him. His piercing, icy blue eyes locked onto Beatrice, who was standing paralyzed in the center of the room, her hand still frozen in mid-air from her theatrical declaration. The silence stretched taut and fragile as a bowstring. Tristan slowly unfastened his wet cloak, handing it without looking to an unseen servant hovering terrified in the hallway. He stepped fully into the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, with a sound of chilling finality. He walked slowly toward Beatrice, his heavy riding boots echoing against the floorboards. When he was mere inches from her, he stopped. He looked down at her, a dangerous, predatory smirk curling the corner of his lips. "I have always admired a woman of her word, or to Beatrice." Tristan's voice was a low, rough baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. He reached out, taking her trembling, cold hand in his warm, calloused one, and bowed gracefully to press a brief, scorching kiss against her knuckles. He straightened his gaze, never leaving her wide, panicked eyes. "I accept your proposal." For a solid minute, the only sound in the Westmoreland drawing-room was the violent pelting of the rain against the glass. Beatrice's mind went entirely blank. She yanked her hand away from the Duke's grasp, as if she had been burned. You heard that?" She stammered, all her previous bravado evaporating into the cold, damp air he had brought in with him. "The walls of this estate are surprisingly thin, and your voice, my lady, carries quite beautifully," Tristan replied smoothly, strolling toward the roaring fireplace to warm his hands. He looked entirely at ease, a stark contrast to the absolute panic seizing the 2 women behind him. It is a rare day when a duke is offered the hand of an earl's daughter quite so spontaneously. I would be a fool to refuse such an advantageous and vigorously declared offer. It was a jest. "Sto!" Beatrice cried, her voice pitching an octave higher than normal. "A momentary lapse of reason, born of frustration. You cannot possibly believe I was serious." "Your Grace, it was a private conversation with my cousin." Tristan turned his back to the fire, the flames casting dancing demonic shadows across his sharp cheekbones and the pale scar on his jaw. A vow made before a witness. He noted, glancing at Penelope, who looked as though she might faint into the nearest armchair, "and a solemn oath sworn upon your life. I am a soldier, Lady Beatrice. I take oaths very seriously." "This is absurd. You are mad," Beatrice breathed, stepping backward. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," Tristan countered, his eyes darkening. "I know you are 21. I know you read Locke and Rousseau when you ought to be reading fashion plates. I know you deliberately spilled wine on Lord Castlereagh's boots last season because you disagreed with his foreign policy. And I know you are currently facing a wretched betrothal to Lord Rutledge." He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. I also know that I require a wife. Immediately. Beatrice stared at him, bewildered. You require a wife? You have spent the last 3 years avoiding respectable society, entirely making a mockery of the marriage mart. Tristan's expression tightened, a flash of genuine grimness, replacing his mocking amusement. Behind the scandal and the swagger lay a very real, very urgent political crisis. Lord Liverpool, the Prime Minister, had summoned Tristan the night before. A vicious rumour planted by his Whig rivals was circulating through Whitehall, a rumour regarding a highly treasonous correspondence with exiled French officials during his time in Paris. To secure his seat in the House of Lords and silence the whispers that threatened to see him charged with treason, Tristan needed to project immediate, unshakable stability. He needed an unimpeachable English bride from a staunchly loyal Tory family. The Earl of Westmoreland's daughter was the perfect shining shield. He had ridden to the estate to negotiate a formal, likely painful arrangement with John Fane. Hearing Beatrice's desperate, reckless vow through the door had been a stroke of unbelievable luck. My reasons are my own, Lady Beatrice, Tristan said quietly, closing the distance between them again. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. But let us speak of your reasons. If you retract your vow now, your father will betroth you to Rutledge by nightfall. I saw the Viscount's carriage approaching as I rode in. The man has the settlement papers in his pocket. Beatrice choked on a gasp, her eyes flying to the window. Sure enough, through the driving rain, she could barely make out the crest on a black carriage pulling into the cobblestone drive. Marry me, Tristan said, his voice, dropping to a harsh whisper, meant only for her. I offer you the protection of my title access to a fortune that dwarfs your father's, and the freedom to live as you please at my country estate, far away from the stifling rules of London. In exchange, you will stand by my side this season and play the part of a devoted duchess. A marriage of convenience, she whispered, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. A business arrangement, he corrected, with the added benefit of saving you from a lifetime of categorizing dead beetles. The drawing-room doors burst open. John Fane, the Earl of Westmoreland, strode in his face, purple with outrage, closely followed by the stooped, wheezing figure of Viscount Rutledge. Beatrice, the Earl bellowed, oblivious to the towering Duke standing by the fire. Lord Rutledge is here to finalize the... The Earl stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes bulging as he finally registered the presence of the Duke of Harrington in his private family parlour. Your Grace, he stammered, the colour draining from his ruddy face. We were not expecting you. I was told you were waiting in my study. Tristan stepped smoothly in front of Beatrice, effectively shielding her from her father's wrath and the Viscount's watery gaze. My apologies, Westmoreland. Tristan lied effortlessly, his tone dripping with aristocratic authority. I could not wait in the study. I came to seek your daughter out immediately. You see, I have come to formally ask for her hand in marriage. Lord Rutledge let out a wet, gasping sound. The Earl's jaw dropped completely open. Her hand, the Earl repeated, looking between his rebellious daughter and the most infamous peer in England. But Lord Rutledge and I are surely men of the world who understand that a duke outranks a viscount. Tristan finished coldly staring the older men down. He turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder at Beatrice. The mask of the ruthless aristocrat was perfectly in place, but in his eyes she saw a challenge. Do we have a deal? His eyes asked. Beatrice looked at her father's shocked face. She looked at Lord Rutledge, who was currently dabbing his sweaty brow with a handkerchief that smelled strongly of camphor. She thought of the heavy, suffocating chains of the life they had planned for her. Then she looked at the broad, unyielding back of the Duke of Harrington, a man wrapped in darkness, scandal, and danger, but a man who had just offered her an escape route. She stepped out from behind him, lifting her chin with every ounce of aristocratic pride she possessed. "It is true, father," Beatrice said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, though her hands were shaking violently, hidden in the folds of her skirt. "The Duke has made me an offer, and I have accepted." Within 48 hours, the announcement was printed in the Morning Post. The shockwaves rattled the windows of every elite mansion in London. Lady Castlereagh nearly choked on her morning tea, and the exclusive halls of White's Club buzzed with bets on how long the tempestuous union would last. Lady Beatrice Fane, the fiercely intelligent and notoriously stubborn daughter of the Earl of Westmoreland, was to wed the Devil of Devonshire. The trap was sprung. The vows were set. But as Beatrice stood on the terrace of her father's home the night before, the wedding looking out at the darkened city, she realized that marrying the first man who walked through the door might have saved her from boredom, but it had thrust her directly into the fire. The wedding of Lady Beatrice Fane to Tristan Cavendish, the Duke of Harrington, at St. George's, Hanover Square, was a spectacle of suffocating tension. The congregation of London's elite sat in breathless silence, waiting for the groom to exhibit the madness the ton so gleefully attributed to him. Beatrice, encased in heavy ivory Brussels lace, kept her chin elevated, refusing to flinch under the hostile glare of Sarah Villiers in the front pew. Beside her, her father radiated a smug, victorious energy. When Tristan finally took her hand, his skin was shockingly cold. He delivered his vows in a flat, guttural baritone that barely registered over the vicar's trembling voice. There was no kiss to seal the union, merely the scratching of a quill and a hasty retreat. Within the hour, they were sealed inside a velvet-lined carriage bearing the Harrington crest, tearing westward toward Devonshire. The 3-day journey was a masterclass in psychological endurance. Tristan buried himself in heavily redacted missives, completely ignoring the woman he had just sworn to cherish. Beatrice stared out the rain-streaked window, her initial defiance giving way to a creeping dread. She was legally bound to a cipher of a man, a disgraced soldier, who looked at her, not with a husband's warmth, but with a tactician's cold calculation. On the evening of the 3rd day, they ascended into the unforgiving, misty expanses of Dartmoor. Looming out of the gloom was Wycliffe Hall. It was not a grand manor, but a brutalist fortress of jagged grey stone that seemed to claw at the darkening sky. "Welcome to your gilded cage, Duchess," Tristan muttered, stepping out into the biting wind. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her since Middlesex. For the first fortnight, they inhabited the sprawling, draughty estate like two ghosts, strictly avoiding the same corridors. Tristan sequestered himself in his ground-floor study, receiving mysterious, cloaked riders at all hours of the night. Beatrice, refusing to succumb to the melancholy of her isolation, forcefully commandeered a dapple-grey mare from the stables and rode fiercely across the moors. Upon returning, she covertly observed the peculiar rhythms of the household. The servants did not cower before Tristan, as the London gossip-mongers claimed. They moved with military precision and absolute, unquestioning loyalty. More suspiciously, Beatrice noted the discarded wax seals in the hearth ashes, seals bearing the crests of French port authorities in Calais and Marseille. The tipping point arrived on a Tuesday, accompanied by a violent Atlantic storm that rattled the leaded glass of the ancient hall. Tristan had ridden out to inspect a damaged tenant roof, leaving the heavy oak door of his sanctum carelessly ajar. Driven by an intoxicating mixture of boredom and lethal curiosity, Beatrice slipped inside. The room was a tempest of scattered maps, open ledgers, and loose parchment. On the center of his mahogany desk lay a crumpled, half-burned letter. Beatrice smoothed the brittle paper. The text was French, but not the lyrical phrasing she had mastered in her father's Mayfair library. It was a chaotic jumble of letters, a cipher. Her brilliant mind, starved of stimulation, for weeks instantly recognized the structure. She pulled out the Duke's heavy leather chair and grabbed a fresh sheet of parchment. It bore the hallmarks of a visionaire cipher, a complex cryptographic method she had studied from a rare text her father kept locked away. Using the date scrawled at the top as her probable key, she began to feverishly substitute the letters as thunder shook the floorboards beneath her. Shipment of bullion delayed. Fouché suspects a leak in the Admiralty. Inform Somerset that the harbour at Toulon is clear for the blockade. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. Joseph Fouché was Napoleon's terrifying Minister of Police. Fitzroy Somerset was the military secretary to Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Tristan was not a traitor to the crown. He was a deep-cover operative, funneling critical French intelligence directly to the highest echelons of the British Army. I was informed my wife possessed an inquisitive nature. Beatrice shot to her feet, knocking the heavy crystal inkwell across the desk. Tristan stood in the doorway, his riding cloak dripping rainwater onto the Turkish rug. His eyes were murderous, a predator, finding an intruder in its den. I did not realize I had married a trespasser. He snarled, advancing into the dimly lit room. Beatrice refused to retreat. She clutched the deciphered text to her chest. You are working for Wellington. This letter, it details French gold shipments, the treason rumors in London. You let them call you a traitor to protect your intelligence network. Tristan stopped dead, the lethal fury in his icy blue eyes, shattered, replaced by absolute, unadulterated shock. He snatched the parchment from her hands, his eyes darting over her neat, precise translation. How did you do this? He demanded, his voice a hoarse whisper. I am an earl's daughter. Your Grace. We read more than fashion plates. She fired back, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Why didn't you inform Lord Liverpool? If the Whig party pushes this false treason narrative, you will be sent to the Tower. Tristan dragged a trembling hand through his wet hair. The invincible Duke suddenly looked like an exhausted, battered soldier. Because the leak is in Liverpool's own cabinet, he confessed, leaning heavily against the mahogany desk. If I clear my name officially, I expose a dozen men embedded in Paris. They will hang within the week. I needed a staunchly Tory bride to force the Prime Minister to stall the investigation. I needed time. Beatrice stared at him, the entire chaotic tapestry of their arrangement finally making sense. He hadn't married her for spite or convenience. He had married her to save his comrades' lives. You are a fool, Tristan, she said softly, stepping closer. You think you must bear this alone. My father has private couriers that bypass the Home Office. We can send this to Somerset directly. I can code the missives for you. Tristan looked down at her, the rigid tension leaving his broad shoulders. Slowly he reached out his rough knuckles, grazing the warmth of her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. You would risk the gallows for a man you swore to marry as a parlour joke, he murmured. Beatrice met his gaze without flinching. I made a vow, Your Grace, and I take my oaths very seriously. The return of the Duke and Duchess of Harrington to London at the height of the season sent shock waves through the aristocracy. When their carriage pulled up to the grand, sweeping steps of Carlton House for the Prince Regent's midsummer fete, a hush fell over the glittering courtyard. Beatrice emerged like a conquering queen, draped in midnight blue silk and dripping in the legendary Harrington diamonds. Tristan stood beside her, a dark, imposing anchor, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back. To the vultures of the Tun they looked united, terrifying and untouchable. But beneath the surface of silk and diamonds, a deadly game of political chess was reaching its endgame. For the past month in Devonshire, Beatrice had worked tirelessly beside Tristan. Together in the dimly lit study, they had encoded and dispatched critical intelligence through her father's secure networks. The bond forged over maps and ciphers had deepened into a fierce, unspoken passion. The marriage of convenience had burned away, leaving a genuine, desperate love in its ashes, but their survival hinged entirely on tonight. As they moved through the opulent mirrored ballroom, Beatrice could feel the hostile stares. The Whig faction, desperate to remove Tristan's Tory vote from the House of Lords, was circling. Near the grand champagne fountains, Lord Henry Brougham and a slimy, ambitious politician named Lord Orris intercepted them. Aris's smile was thin and cruel. "Your Grace." "Duchess," Aris sneered, bowing too deeply. "A surprise to see you in London. We had heard the country air was necessary for your delicate constitution, Harrington. Or perhaps you were simply avoiding the questions the Home Office has been asking regarding your French correspondence." Tristan's jaw tightened, the pale scar on his cheek standing out in stark relief. Before he could speak, Beatrice stepped forward, her voice ringing out clearly over the string quartet, intentionally drawing the attention of the surrounding aristocrats, including Prime Minister Lord Liverpool, who was standing nearby. "The Duke has nothing to hide from the Home Office, Lord Aris," Beatrice stated loudly, her dark eyes flashing with aristocratic disdain. "In fact, my husband has been conducting vital business on behalf of the Crown, business that some in this very room have actively tried to sabotage." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Lord Liverpool stepped forward, his brow furrowed in alarm. "Lady Harrington, those are grave accusations. The rumours surrounding your husband's correspondence are a carefully constructed smokescreen, my lord," Beatrice interrupted smoothly. She reached into the bodice of her gown and withdrew a thick sealed parchment bearing a heavily embossed crest. She handed it directly to the Prime Minister. A missive, Lord Liverpool from Lord Fitzroy Somerset, written on behalf of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Beatrice announced, her voice unwavering. "It details the exact nature of my husband's intelligence work in Paris, confirms the extraction of his operatives, and heavily implicates certain members of the Whig Party in attempting to intercept British military secrets for their own political gain." Lord Aris went completely white, taking a stumbling step backward. Lord Brougham looked as though he had swallowed a lemon. The Prime Minister broke the seal, his eyes scanning the heavy parchment. The ballroom was so silent one could hear the wax dripping from the chandeliers. Liverpool's expression shifted from skepticism to profound shock, and finally to deep, respectful awe. He looked up, locking eyes with Tristan. "Your Grace," Liverpool said, his voice carrying the weight of the British Empire. "It appears the Crown owes you a debt of gratitude we can never fully repay. I shall see to it that these baseless rumours are permanently silenced." He shot a lethal glare at Lord Aris. "Guards escort Lord Aris to my private study. We have much to discuss regarding treason." The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers as Aris was unceremoniously dragged away. Beatrice felt a massive, suffocating weight lift from her chest. It was over. They had won. Tristan did not care about the Prime Minister, the Prince Regent, or the staring aristocrats. He turned entirely toward his wife, his eyes blazing with a heat that made her breath hitch. Without a word, he took her hand and pulled her away from the crowded floor, dragging her through a set of French doors out onto the darkened stone balcony overlooking St. James's Park. The cool night air hit Beatrice's flushed face. Before she could speak, Tristan backed her against the stone balustrade. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. "You are magnificent," he breathed, his rough voice cracking with raw emotion. "You are the most terrifying, brilliant woman in England, and I am entirely at your mercy." "You are a duke," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked up into his eyes. "You are at no one's mercy." "I am at yours," Tristan corrected fiercely. He leaned in his lips, brushing against hers. "You saved my life, Beatrice. You saved my honor. When you swore to marry the first man who walked through that door, I thought I was capturing a convenient shield. I did not realize I was surrendering to my ruin." "Are you ruined, Tristan?" she asked, a soft, teasing smile playing on her lips. "Utterly," he vowed. He kissed her, then not with the cold finality of their wedding day, but with a searing, desperate hunger that consumed them both. It was a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared secrets, fierce loyalty, and a passion that defied every rigid rule of the society they had just conquered. Beatrice wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, knowing that her careless, reckless vow had been the greatest stroke of luck in her life. She had asked for a stranger, and fate had delivered her a king. What began as a desperate jest in a Mayfair drawing room became the most formidable alliance of the London season. Beatrice and Tristan proved that sometimes surrendering to fate is the greatest victory of all. Did this scandalous tale of espionage and unexpected romance capture your heart? If so, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow history lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more.